Um, right, good morning everybody. I'm Kevin Murphy, Secretary of the Society. I'd like to welcome you all to this talk this morning. First of all, just before I introduce our speaker, I'd just like to abuse my position and just mention to everybody that the Culture Night is this Friday night, and the Labour History Society premises in Beggars Bush is open from 4 to 8 p.m. So everybody is welcome. I know Dr. Laura Bambrick yesterday of Congress spoke about, she's been working with the Department of Finance around an exhibition for Culture Night for, on the marriage bar following her talk. So I'm sure there's a Labour history trail around Dublin if you look through the programme. But certainly everybody's welcome to Beggars Bush this Friday. There's trade union banners and ephemera and various just nuggets from the history of the trade union movement in Beggars Bush. Certainly worth a visit. So I'd like to just welcome everybody. This talk is supported by the Department of Tourism, Culture, Arts, Gaeltacht, Sport and Media and the Decade of Centenaries Commemorations Unit and Dublin City Council. And also it's important to reference the support of the wider trade movement throughout the last 4 days. I'm not going to go through all the unions and various corporate sponsors, but they are included in the programme and we're very grateful for them. So our next speaker is Esther Lynch. Esther is currently General Secretary of the European Trade Union Congress. She previously worked as Legislation and Social Affairs Officer with the Irish Congress of Trade Unions before moving to Brussels to take up the role of Deputy General Secretary of the ETUC. So she's now General Secretary. So Esther is going to talk now and on the topic of class and class structure, globalization and austerity. So Esther Lynch.
Good morning. It's great to be here in Dublin, and it's always an honour and a privilege to be able to represent 54 million workers and their trade unions around Europe. Our most recent member joined in Berlin, Ukraine. So we're very happy that our European trade union family is growing. Often things that matter most are the most difficult for us to talk about. I think class can sometimes be a subject like that. In Ireland, my work around Europe, class and class inequality are part and parcel of the political debate, but class less used here in Ireland. And I think it's because at times we're trying to be respectful. Sometimes it's because it sounds too much like what happens in Britain. But not using class disguises power, and it makes it harder for us to identify the structural causes of inequality. Because citizens that don't talk about class can be encouraged to believe that those at the top got there by hard work. That the idea that they deserve this because they worked hard. And this creates a double danger because it not only does it propagate that bad idea, but also it means that the type of measures we're looking for as trade unions and on the left get very easily pushed back. I know it's not how hard you work that determines how much you're paid. The hardest I ever worked was when I was a minimum wage worker and I was paid the least. It's hard work, it's paid least. The Irish Times this morning has an article on widespread exploitation of delivery workers linked to middlemen and falling payments from food delivery companies. The person interviewed there talks about in 2021 that it was around €4 for a job, and now it's around €1 for a job. And he says it seems that they're testing the waters to see how low they can pay people. And I think that's my first ask to everybody here, is to be very active in making sure that the EU introduces legislation to end forever bogus self-employment and to make sure that platform companies recognise that these are in fact workers and their labour is as worthy of protection as all other workers. And I think that's just in some answer to the really interesting discussion about the EU this morning. The problem we have in Europe, and indeed globally, is that companies are now so much bigger than individual member states. And for us to be able to hold them to account, trying to do that as a small country is so much harder. But getting together and to say, to have access to this market, then you have to protect a threshold of decency. And a threshold of decency means recognizing when workers are in fact workers and not pretending that they're self-employed people, and bringing us back 100 years to the terms and conditions that used to exist 100 years ago. We know that the richest 1% of households hold more wealth than the entire bottom 70%. In 2022, the FTSE 100 increased the pay of CEOs by 31%. The average is 109 times the salary of the average worker. And I want now to give a big shout out to the United Auto Workers in America, who have demanded a 40% rise for their members over the next years. The reason they're demanding that is because that's what the CEOs got. They got 40%. Why should CEOs get 40% and not the workers? I very much hope they're successful, and the ETUC is in close contact with the AFL-CIO. I met Liz Schuler last weekend about it, and everything we can do collectively to support them is an important fight to win. Similarly, the writers' strike, that's also an important strike to win, because we can't let AI replace jobs that should be done by humans. In Ireland, it's CRH, the biggest ratio of, that's 289 to 1. So there's an overwhelming argument for capping pay at the top, for having ratios, but most importantly, for reinforcing collective bargaining. We need the 90% to become allies through their trade unions. The economic structures are not working for anybody. The only way that we address this as trade unions is through ensuring people can join a union and have their right to collective bargaining recognised. And I want to congratulate Owen and the work that the ICTU and all the trade unions are doing here in Ireland at this moment to make sure to get the most possible from the minimum wage directive. That directive, again, from Europe, requires all member states that do not have 80% of the workforce covered by a collective agreement to put in place an enabling environment to make sure that that is achieved. And let me be very clear, that directive is crystal clear. Only bona fide trade unions do collective bargaining, not some other outfits. When we look at inequality, Denmark holds the title for the most socially mobile country in the world. It has a score, the World Economic Forum score of 85.2%, which numbers don't always mean an awful lot to me. So I've said to somebody, well, what does that really mean? They said, look, Esther, what it means is that for a person born into a very low income family in Denmark, within 2 generations, so by the time they have grandchildren, their grandchildren can have achieved the median income. And if you look somewhere like Africa or South Africa, that's going to be like 9 generations. It's going to be much, much longer. And what all the countries at the top with really good mobility scores have, whether it's Norway or Sweden or Iceland, what they all have is affordable housing, quality education with equal access, healthcare. They guarantee the right to collective bargaining. They've union density and coverage around 80–90%. They've good working conditions around quality public services that everybody uses. Everybody sees the public services for them. And they have inclusive institutions. Now, the challenge of that, whether it's healthcare, housing, education, work protection, or public services, is that if we introduce austerity, if we go back to what we had under Barroso and the Troika times, austerity damages all of that. And we're currently living through the evidence of the past austerity period. Millennials, now in their 20s and 30s, are the first generation in Europe and in Ireland to have lower living standards than the previous one. Now, I see that in my family. I have much better life than my mother had. I have equality, I have a pension, I can work at jobs. If I look at my son, he works in the hospitality. As many of you know, he's a chef. And I see him and his friends, they wait for a text message to call them into work. And sometimes they get called into work and then the employer looks around and says, "Ah, no, it's very quiet tonight, you go home." And that's in so many families, that the terms and conditions that they see that their children have are so much worse than they have. And in the discussion that we have about why the rise of the far right, when you look and match those areas where inequality and where there has been a reversal of social mobility, that's one of the key determinants of the rise of the far right. Families being concerned about their future. But then, where people do break through and they make it into the types of professions where they can expect to be well paid and they're from working class backgrounds, then we see that there is also a class ceiling, because not only is it harder to get in, even when you get in, you will experience a pay gap. There's a pay gap of around 13%. And I mention that because in Ireland, there is no protection against discrimination on the basis of class. Many of you know I used to run an unemployed centre in Ballymum, lived in Ballymum. And what we noticed when I was living there, it was part of my story, it's part of my work that I did there, is that depending on where you said you were living, whether you would even get called for an interview, let alone get the job. And then also it was how you spoke when you turned up for the interview. Accents seem to still matter. So there is a value in continuing to have a discussion about protecting discrimination on the basis of class. In fact, the EU Charter already requires that. Many of the EU member states have in place discrimination to protect people. It often most used in relation to access to housing where people can't get rent. In Belgium, there's a lot of cases, trade unions are involved in a lot of support for people who can't get access to rent a flat because of the class that they're from. Then finally, because I know that we're under pressure of time, I want to challenge what I'm going to call a bourgeois view that working class is something you have to leave if you want to escape poverty. No job should pay poverty wages. No job should have poor terms and conditions. Everybody should be able to live well, feel secure, and have a job that will give you the type of ability, the economic ability, to shape your own life. It was never true, for example, that caring and cleaning were no-skill work, or even low-skill work. What was demonstrated very clearly during the COVID crisis was they literally were life and death work, absolutely necessary to the success of the enterprise. Of course, this work is predominantly done by women and migrants, and so it needs to be re-evaluated. And let's not forget or overlook that at the same time as the EU adopted the Minimum Wage Directive with the push towards people being able to unionise, they also adopted the Pay Transparency Directive. And what that directive does is it enables and supports unions to be able to raise work of equal value, to look at work that's predominantly done by women, for example, caring and cleaning, and to challenge the basis, why is that work paid so little? And to begin to look cross-sector and to take cases sector-wide. We're going to need all hands on deck to be able to develop both the collective bargaining strategies, but also the legal strategies when we will need them. So we have a very rich environment going to take place throughout Europe in those member states that don't currently have 80% coverage, for us to work together, to support each other, to look at what we're doing, and then to begin to join up those campaigns. That we need to have a lot more cross-border discussions, and the reason we need to have them is because the companies are certainly having them. So we need to join up and talk and support each other a lot more. The ETUC adopted in Berlin our manifesto, Together for a Fair Deal. What it calls for is all workers to join a union, unions to work together to build an economy and society that's just as good for the carer and the cleaner as for the bank manager, for the truck driver as the doctor or the lawyer. We want to build a society that's just as good for the office worker, the farm worker, as it is for the Taoiseach. This is achievable. We know that because we see in different member states already close to steps towards achieving that. That's why it's important that we open up debates. That's why I'm here, to have a discussion. And that's why it's important that we name the issue of class the structures underpinning it, and then in that way to identify how unions can begin to challenge that effectively throughout the EU. Thank you, colleagues.
Thanks very much, Esther. We might get a couple of roving mics there if we maybe have a couple of volunteers or if the lads want to. Can I take questions? And I ask people maybe to keep them. Yeah, John, just there. Yeah. I just ask people to any comments to keep them as short as possible, so to give everyone as much opportunity. Yeah.
Finn Geeney from Dublin Council of Trade Unions. Esther has done us an enormous service in placing austerity at the centre of the struggles, even to the extent of saying how the right wing exploit austerity in order to achieve their objectives. And it's not a genetically conditioned racism that's at the back of it, but austerity. But the principal failure has been that of social democratic governments across Europe. 20 years ago, the majority of European countries had social democratic governments. Today, the Socialist Party is gone in Italy, and in its place is the right-wing government with a person with a fascist background. Incidentally, it's worth mentioning that the Communist Party of Italy, which is once the biggest communist party outside of Russia, has disappeared. And the reason it did is because they associated themselves with the Christian Democratic government, and Berlinguer, who was a leader at the time, was mainly responsible for that. But the Socialist Party has also gone in France. I mean, Hollande, because of the programme he conducted, has meant that the Socialist Party today no longer has any influence in France. And then in its place is a kind of cross-infection from the Social Democratic failures represented by Macron. So it was the failures of Social Democratic governments over the period of austerity, their failure to stop privatisation, their failure to maintain the public services across a range of countries, which has allowed for the disappearance of the Social Democratic parties, and also insofar as they existed, the Communist parties. In France, Georges Marchais was once a significant figure in the French labour movement to the extent he stood and got a creditable vote in the presidential elections. That party has lost its influence. So I just contend that it was the failure of the Social Democratic governments, including Sweden, by the way. The Social Democrats in Sweden were in power for 40 years. And today we had the rise of the Sweden Democrats. So all of this is linked. And I just wanted to refer back to my original point. Esther has done us a favour in placing austerity and the struggle against austerity at the centre of our politics. And all left-wing parties should identify that and not get swept aside into some kind of chimeras about what the real issues are. Austerity is the issue. Austerity is at the core of why we are where we are. And the failures of social democratic governments to fight austerity has led us to where we are today.
Do you want?
I'm lucky I don't have to speak for, is this working? Yeah, it's okay. So I'm lucky that I don't need to speak for the Social Democratic Party. So there's, but if I can say, the current challenge is that the EU had a set of very bad fiscal rules that led to all of the decisions taken by the ECB, the EU and the IMF in Ireland. All of those were then suspended during the period of COVID, and some very good measures were put in place. So the question is, by the end of this year, do we keep this suspension and the capacity to have instruments, or do we go back to the old rules we had under Barroso? That's a political decision. We need to make sure how each of the MEPs are voting, because it's very important that you're in contact with the Irish MEPs as well. But there's every risk that by the end of the year, we end up with a set of rules that will not allow an investment, for example, for the just transition, will restrict the ability to provide all sorts of public services. We've done calculations for different member states, how many less nurses, whether or not the funds will be there for, as I said, the just digital transition or the just green transition. But these are all political decisions that are capable of being affected by real action by working people. And I think that's the challenge that we have at the moment, is so many workers just feel disempowered. They won't vote, for example, in the European elections in 2024. And the people who are mainly mobilising people to vote are the far right, exactly as you said. Interestingly, the far right party in Italy is very active in talking against austerity. So you're right, they have managed to capture a lot of our ideas. They've dressed themselves up in them, and they've dressed up a very hateful ideology as being something that, that's good for workers. But it's not, and that is the key moment that we're in. On the 13th of October, everyone's invited to Paris. The French trade unions are putting on a major first demonstration against EU austerity and for wage increases. And then we think Owen will be at the ETUC executive at the end of this month, and we will make a decision about whether we call a Euro demonstration, whether we ask all workers around Europe to come to Brussels to make sure that those austerity rules are ones that look nothing like the old rules that led to the Troika. But I stress, these are decisions. They're not automatic. They're decisions, and we can influence them. The important thing is that we influence them at the time we can change things, rather than when it's too late, after those new rules are in place, and then we're campaigning against cuts. We need to stop the bad rules getting adopted in the first place, and the end of this year is when that will happen if we don't mobilise against it.
Thanks very much, Esther. I think John, has a question there.
Thank you very much, Esther. I was very heartened listening to what you said, and I think I kind of know in advance the answer to my question to you, but I want to put it anyway, because we heard earlier from Sean Byers, who had a kind of an open question at the end as to whether Europe was the problem or a potential solution, and arguing that a kind of socialist exit was still an option. But it seems to me that the kind of phenomena that the previous speaker was referring to occurred not principally because of Europe, but within both national frameworks, political frameworks, and also as the result of much deeper structural changes, deindustrialization, so on and so forth. So my question to you is whether you think that the EU as such, which to me seems to be an absolutely fundamental framework for our actions in the future, is indeed part of the solution, and if so, in what particular ways? Or whether you think that the EU makes more difficult the kind of progressive left-wing politics that you're talking about.
So the critical answer to that is the makeup of the Parliament. Because the makeup of the Parliament then decides the political makeup of the Commission. And then also the Member States. So we have, it's almost like a three-ring circus. So every action that the EU takes, every law it adopts, it goes through a process of the Commission have to put forward a proposal, then the Parliament amends that proposal, and then the Council amends the Commission proposal, and then all three institutions get together and hammer out the final thing. But the key determinant of what either the Member States decide or what the Parliament decides depends on who's in power. It's who has power. And so that's why the 2024 elections, for the European elections, are so important. But the danger always is with the European elections is that the people who are sent to Europe are not people with a great socialist vision or a workers' vision for Europe. They're people who point out everything Europe's doing wrong. And so people say, well, send them there so that they fix it. But it's not good enough just to point out what's going wrong there. You have to have a vision for how to make sure that the rules of the single market are fair for workers. Because there has to be things on which we don't allow member states to compete. And in this term, we got everybody to agree, all that big circus to agree, that we don't compete on low wages and bad terms and conditions by keeping unions out. Instead of that, we build a high-road competition built on things other than low wages and bad conditions achieved by keeping unions out. We also made sure that we have a stronger pay equality between men and women. The challenge also now is to make sure that we're not competing by having a whole lot of fake self-employment, and that coming as, you know, as like a hoover underneath all the existing EU employment rights. So that is also the challenge we're in. What's coming next at member state level is we need to make sure that we implement that. But the European Trade Union Movement has a lot of good ideas for what the next 4 years need to be. So one of those has to be the human in control of AI. Can't be the case that we turn up at work and a machine decides, you know, whether we get overtime, whether, you know, how fast we have to work, monitors, you know, what your feelings are. I know I travel around quite a bit, and I noticed in a lot of hotels, they're very interested in how my check-in experience was. Was it a smiley face or an unhappy face? And I always hit a smiley face. And times I'm doing that and saying, but you're cooperating with something that's very bad. I said, yeah, but I do that to make sure for all the horrible people who just because they, you know, didn't like the way I was treated, will hit an unhappy face. But the companies are so interested in that. As soon as an AI tool becomes cheaply available, that will just monitor the worker and see how happy they are, they will use that. We have to prevent that before it even gets into a workplace. We have to stop it. And so we need strong rules, also in relation to if you're strapped to a machine or it's shown up in the workplace. It's too late when we're dealing with people who are hurt, injured or killed. We have to make sure to build those types of rules in from the ground up. In fact, it's almost late already. We need to make sure, for example, that there's no patent or you can't put a product on the market in Europe unless you have the human in control principle. So there's lots of different ideas. As I said, we have a manifesto with a full list. We want to get back to more secure work. That's one of the biggest challenges I think that we're facing at the moment is insecurity. Also, we need to ban unpaid work, all the unpaid internships and all of that. All that has to stop. We also need a right to anticipation of change. So we get information about what's about to happen. And we also need a right to training. So we need to be able to be guaranteed that workers get the training to be able to have hope that they will be able to succeed in the future. And all of that comes down to choices. It comes down to what European Parliament, the trade union movement, will be dealing with for the 4 years after 2024. But there's every risk it will be a far-right parliament if we don't change the way in which people are polling to say that they're intending to vote. At the moment, the polls suggest, and I don't even want to say because I'm on thing, but the polls are very bad. So, yes, so it's very important that we don't give up hope and we don't despair, but rather that we really engage, that we engage at the level of the workplace to say why the far right offers nothing to working people. In reality, we can look at their past voting to know that for sure, for the evidence, but then also that we're active at national level and at European level to make sure that both national elections and also European elections return progressive forces who will genuinely stand up for workers and their rights.
Thank you, Esther. And it's interesting to note that the hotel industry doesn't ask for smiley face or sad face around their pricing structures at the moment, because several people have mentioned just travelling from abroad for this conference, the price of hotels in Dublin, and obviously the trade union movement are very much involved around the VAT rate and everything. I think there's somebody over on this side, sorry, I can't, yeah.
Thanks, Esther. As always, very clear. It's a joy when you listen to somebody actually talking about Europe in a way that, you know, is understandable. Really, a question and a bit of déjà vu. First of all, the question is on what is the ETUC doing around the area of health and safety for gig economy workers. I mean, that's a massive thing. We talk about wages, but in fact, you know, the protection of their lives obviously comes even before wages. But the second thing is, you mentioned class and you mentioned job evaluation at one stage about re-evaluation. And my deja vu one is, who decides on what the evaluations are? Yeah.
So I'm excited to answer you, because in the Pay Transparency Directive, we actually got the hypothetical comparator. Because I remember you telling me about 25 years ago, Esther, we need to get the hypothetical comparator sorted out. Because the challenge, if you don't have that comparator, is that you always need to find somebody who you're sitting beside, who you can compare yourself to. Whereas in care, the whole sector is undervalued and underpaid. So Mags, I really hope that directive is helpful to you and everybody who's been championing the cause of equal pay for so long. On health and safety, so the EU is already very clear that the employer is responsible for the safety of their worker. The business model of a lot of the platform companies is to avoid all of those responsibilities by saying, I'm not an employer. And they've been encouraged to do that. They've been enabled to do that by labour inspectorates who've looked the other way. Trade unions have been very successful in taking cases, but it's exhausting work because it's person by person, case by case, and it's just a scandal. And I've no problem being quoted on that. It is a scandal that it's taken so long to get the EU directive on platform work over the line. We all saw during the COVID crisis how those workers went through extraordinary, that they put their lives, exactly as you said, at risk to make sure to get us, to feed us, to make sure that we had everything to live our lives. And now, at the end of that crisis, we still can't guarantee them the same protection as every other worker. That's a scandal. It needs to end, and we need to make sure that that directive forces every member state to properly recognise and end bogus self-employment. There's one other thing I didn't say, but and it's important that I say it because I know Danny McCoy is going to be here. The Ursula von der Leyen, who's the president of the EU Commission, had a State of the Union speech this week. And in that speech, she called for a resurgence of social dialogue. She called it a new Val Duchesse. The Val Duchesse put into the EU treaty the ability for employers and unions to sit down at EU level and to write agreements which would then be extended like an erga omnes to all workers in Europe. I'm currently leading the negotiations with the employers. We've got make or break on Monday and Tuesday for an EU directive on telework and the right to disconnect, which we're going to conclude. And when we conclude it, we give it and it becomes a directive. So what would be really interesting, I can't ask it, but somebody here could, would be to ask Danny McCoy what his vision is for what the future agreements could be between... Sorry? Nominate Pat Bolger to ask this, exactly. So we need a question to Danny McCoy that did he hear Ursula von der Leyen's call for EU-level social dialogue, and what Danny McCoy's view is of what we could begin to negotiate at EU level, because I'd really like to hear his view on that, is what role he sees for social partners to write and introduce EU-level directives on different employment rights. I will do.
Okay.
Yeah, just a question I would like to ask to yourself, Esther. Let's live as trade unionists, as politics where we call ourselves communist or socialist in the reality we are today. My colleague behind me has said it. The socialist and communist parties and what we call in Ireland the Labour Party, they're gone. And why are they gone? Why are people not joining the trade union movement? Let's be honest, in Ireland, only for the sake that the majority of members come from the public sector, there would be, dare I say it, a very, very small trade union movement in Ireland. Simply, we are not getting membership from the public sector. And why? My reality is, because I know the people, I like yourself, Esther, Dolphin House and that. I know the realities of life. I know what my own daughters are telling me. I know what my grandchildren are telling me. You are all part of the establishment. We are not going to work with you. We are not going to join with you. All we can do at the moment is create a movement that we are only members of and give that movement for social justice as much help as we can and as much money to get themselves off the ground. We are not the leaders because we can't be the leaders. We have destroyed over the last 50 or 60 years our own credibility.
Well, I don't accept that. And the reason I don't accept that is because it's neither the reality nor a credible plan for the future. So the reality is that trade unions have been operating in Ireland in a very hostile environment. They have faced uphill challenges, and I'm very hopeful, and I don't want to speak on behalf of Owen Reedy because he's here, but I'm very hopeful that the ICTU will be able to secure a law that will withstand the challenge. Let's not forget that the ICTU has on numerous occasions managed to negotiate and get in place laws, for example, sector agreements, and then some employer took us to the Supreme Court. So the difference now with the EU directive is that the EU law overrides the constitutional provision, because you have to have, as being part of the European Union, you have to go along with that. In my view, the EU law is much more closely aligned to the European Convention on Human Rights than ever the Supreme Court Justice was. And in fact, when the ICTU took the complaint to the ILO, that was confirmed as well. So I'm very hopeful that given an operating environment similar to what the Nordics have, Irish trade unions will be as successful as unions in those countries of recruiting members and of representing them. There's no reason to think otherwise. I know there's nothing magical about a union official in Sweden. There's nothing more magical about them than the hard-working union officials here in Ireland, the hard-working union organisers here in Ireland, who have an uphill battle, the like of which very, very few unions anywhere else in Europe have to deal with. So I'm hopeful that given the right environment, we will see that curve change. We should get behind everybody who's doing that difficult work, and we should encourage them and believe that we can get there. That's my plan. That's what the ETUC is doing. No, I believe I am. I'm not naive about that. But I'm convinced that in 5 years there will be real change.
I'm just going to take one last question. So just this individual here. Sorry, I can't see. Eamon Thornton, yeah.
My name, and I'm making this contribution based on not only my lifelong trade union activism, but also my role as an elected member pension trustee in the private sector. Pension funds are one of the big, and the investment of pension funds are one of the big ways that we can influence the direction of capitalism. One of the most interesting developments in that context in recent years has come from Europe and the European directive, in which the concept of what's called ESG, environmental, social and governance accreditation for investment, is becoming more talked about through Europe, but not here. And this is coming back to the point that was made in the paper about the need for cross-border communications and so on. Unfortunately, in this country, certainly in the private sector, we seem to be still stuck on the debate at the point where defined benefit pensions are good and defined contributions are bad, but the reality has moved way beyond that in the last couple of decades. And also we have a situation where the Pension Authority is actively pursuing a policy to discourage the involvement of elected member trustees and trying to increase the power of the professionals. And it's going against the tide that we need to be controlling. So my question is really about that. Is there an opportunity for progress to be made on our wider goals through that sort of cross-border cooperation and communication among the trade union movement?
Yeah, so one of the things I have been most surprised at is the fundamental, and you would probably know this, I know that you would know this much better, right? It's the fundamental difference in the way pensions are funded around Europe. And that makes working together more of a challenge. It doesn't make it impossible, and in fact it just makes it, it just reinforces the need for the ETUC to develop a way for our affiliates to communicate more, but also for us to come up with some strategies. We hope there isn't, for example, agreement on a pension age in Europe, even within the trade union movement. What there is agreement on is that it must always be done through social dialogue and in agreement with the trade unions, both the way in which pensions are funded, but also the age at which and the conditions at which you can get a pension. I know that's a kind of a waffly answer, but I'm not in a position to say anything other than that in relation to the pensions. It would be helpful for us to establish a working committee, I think, on pensions. And we have soundings out to the affiliates after the Berlin Congress on that, about whether they're interested in that. The main interest is to protect the pensions, because there is no doubt but that one of the proposals in the new austerity rules is that member states have to calculate the pension out 5 to 10 years and then already put in place money that they don't need they don't need it. They have to have in place money now that they won't actually need for 5 years, and that's inappropriate. So that's one of the key things we're focusing on at the moment. So that's sorry that's such a waffly answer, but that we know it's an area, and we know that we don't have in place the internal structures for the type of deep discussions that we need to have to come up with the appropriate plans and policies to be pursued at EU level, and we are actively discussing that with affiliates. If I come back next year, I'll have a better answer.
Yeah, thanks very much, Esther. I know you've raised a lot of interesting points in your address and the questions, and I know the amount of questions from the audience. There's been a lot of interesting points raised. I'm conscious the next panel, there's 3 speakers, and we'd like to give them as much time as possible. So I'd like everyone to show their appreciation to Esther Lynch.